So we use mutations to edit our data in the state, in the store. Now, just as we shouldn't directly edit the state from inside components, we could also argue that directly reading the state might not be ideal. Why could this be suboptimal? Well, in this app, we got the counter component where I output the counter. Now, let's say for whatever reason, we also have another component, favorite value.view. And in there, we do the same thing as in the counter, but maybe we do more. That's why we have a separate component. So we do more here. Now, of course, we can use this component here in app view. We can import favorite value from components favorite value.view and register this here, and also add this here below the counter, maybe favorite value like this. Now, of course, this will work. We got the counter twice now, and it updates in both components. Now, let's say we decide that actually we always want to output the counter times 2. So we update it here in favorite value, and we update it in the counter. Do you see the problem? We are again replicating logic here. We do have duplicate code. And again, in bigger, more realistic applications, this might absolutely happen, that we need the same kind of data in different components, and then we decide that we want to format or calculate the data differently, and therefore we suddenly need to change it in all the different places. This is why we might not want to directly talk to the state. Instead, we can use a concept called getters, which in the end are, you could say, computed properties defined directly in the store, which we then can use from inside any component of our choice. So here's how we add a getter to our Vuex store. Next to mutations, doesn't matter where exactly, but in the same place as state and mutations, you add getters. This takes an object, and every getter is a method in this object now. So basically, just like computed properties are methods in the computed option of components. Here, we could have the final counter getter, let's say. And the final counter getter method, like all getter methods in Vuex, gets 2 arguments. The current state, which we need to get a value out of it, and other getters. Getting other getters in a getter can be helpful if the value you want to calculate here depends on the result of another getter. But let's ignore that for now. Let's just work with the state argument. We want to return a value here. A getter has to return a value. And the value here is our counter, which is managed in the state, times 2, let's say. And we can now use this getter from any component of our choice. For example, from inside the counter. Here in this computed property, which we keep, we now access this $store, but no longer the state, but instead store.getters dot, and then the name of your getter, which in this case was final counter. So here it's also final counter. And you don't call it, you don't execute it, you just point at it. Like this, like a property. And Vuex will execute this getter method for you then, passing in the current state into the getter. So we do this here in the counter and also in favorite value. And with that, if we ever decide that the counter should be, let's say, the value times 3, we just need to do this in one place instead of in 2 places. So with that, if we go back, you see this works now. And this is the concept of getters. Now, I mentioned that you can have multiple getters and that getters can also depend on each other. Let's say, besides our final counter getter, we have another getter, which is called normalized counter. And the idea here is simple. I want to use my counter value, to be precise, the final counter value, but I want to make sure it's greater than 0 and smaller than 100. And I either output 0 or 100 if one of these boundaries is crossed. Now, one way of building this would be that we recalculate our counter times 3 here, and then we have our final counter here. We check if final counter is smaller than 0, which can't happen here, but let's say we still check it, in which case we return 0. We check if final counter is greater than 100, in which case we return 100. And only if neither of the two things is the case, we return the final counter. As a side note, this also shows us that you of course can have more than one line of code in a getter. That's another advantage of using getters. You can move such code out of components into your Vuex store so that your components stay lean. But now with that we got the normalized counter, and we could use the normalized counter in the favorite value component simply by referring to normalized counter here. That is the name of this getter. And with that, you will see that as soon as we exceed 100, the bottom counter stays at 100 because of the logic we just added. Now this works, but it's not great. We are calculating something which we already calculate in another getter. And that's why we get this getter's second argument here. With that, we can refer to our getters and get our final counter simply by calling getters.finalCounter. And imagine we had more code in there. Replicating that all in another getter is just unnecessary if we already do have a getter for that. So that's why we can use final counter like this here. And in this case, I don't even need the state then, but if we would need it, we could still use it as well in this second getter. Here I will replace the state argument with an underscore, which is a convention signaling my setup, my project setup here, that I do have to take this argument in order to get to the second one, but that I don't want to work with it. Otherwise, this specific project setup would complain about an unused argument. Following this naming convention, it won't complain. And with that, if we reload, we got the same behavior as before, but now in a slightly more elegant way.